Within the prison, I really liked the emphasis and the dedication of the governor and his team to rehabilitating prisoners. They showed great sensitivity around understanding the complexity of the task that's hand, the complexity of issues with which people present in the criminal justice system, and they were really prepared to work in a very humane way, delivering the sentence of the court.
Welcome to the Bailiwick Express podcast. My name is Matthew Leach. I'll be joined each week by a guest for a series of podcasts. Each will shine a light on topics from across the bailiwick. The format will change week to week. We'll have debates, reviews, hot seat interviews and special guests. So stick with us as we offer some insight on some of the most important issues we in the bailiwick face. A former inmate turned prison reform advocate has commended Guernsey's approach to incarceration after visiting the island. Paula Harriott is the head of prisoner involvement at the Prison Reform Trust, a group of campaigners who champion rehabilitation over punishment. She came to Guernsey to speak about lived experience after spending 4 years in prison for drug possession. She spoke to me about why rehabilitation is so important and why justice is never black and white.
What does lived experience mean?
What does lived experience mean?
Well, I suppose we all live through things, don't we? And that is our lived experience. And what I would say is that our lived experience of anything, if you've lived through, cancer, you have lived experience of how having cancer feels, doesn't it? And that gives you a particular insight into that experience that you couldn't get necessarily through reading a book about it. You would understand the nuances, you would understand the emotional impact in a way. You might be able to read, this is a really deeply unsettling experience and you'll experience anxiety. But to live through it brings life to those words. And then when you'll be able to communicate about that lived experience, it'll be conveyed with the same depth of emotion. And the emotional intelligence that derives from that experience, you'll be adding that and amplifying what's written about it. And maybe a lot of communication, just as podcast listeners will know, is not just about the words we use, but it's about the emotion that we can convey. And that emotion is conveyed through accessing the insight of our lived experience quite often.
It's quite an eloquent explanation of what lived experience is. I like that a lot. And so
we often use our lived experiences in all of our interactions with one another. That will be your lived experience of something you witnessed as a child, or your experience at school will have shaped your interests and shaped your passions. And I talk in the context of my work, which is particularly in prisons and criminal justice, probation, reintegration of people with criminal convictions into the community. We have professional expertise and subject matter experts in that world, and we ought to listen to them. But we also ought to integrate the lived experience, the deeper insight of the lived experience of people who've been through the justice system into the discussion, so that we are enriched in our understanding through integration of that lived experience into our work, into our worlds.
And so you've come over to the Channel Islands to talk about your lived experience.
Yeah.
And so your lived experience was that you were in prison yourself.
I was, yeah. So I got sentenced to 8 years in prison in 2004 for supplying cocaine. I was a cocaine user. I was a heavy cocaine user. That was my lived experience. I got 8 years. I served 4 years of that in prison, and then I was paroled and spent 4 years on licence, which is what we call it in the UK.
Yeah.
You're licensed as a serving prisoner, but you're serving the rest of your sentence in the community, and you attend probation once in the first stages once a week, towards the latter stages once a month, to ensure that you're complying with the conditions of that licence. So yeah, I had a very that's not a short sentence.
No, it's a long time.
And as a mother, I was a mother of 5 children, aged between the ages of 9 and 16, 17 when I went to prison. A very deeply impactful sentence, deep at all sorts of levels.
Yeah.
But I think primarily around the loss of identity as a mother, and the shame and the embarrassment, the stigma of that sentence, what that meant, the loss of hope that it meant, the loss of any pride and self-respect that I had in myself, just by virtue of knowing that I had let my children down, let my family down, and let myself down. And that's a very dark place to live.
Yeah.
A very dark place.
And so I wanted to speak specifically. No, I think that's very important to bring up, because I did want to touch base later on talking about the parents, incarcerated parents who have children on the outside. But if we start from the beginning, I suppose, I'm interested to know what your lived experience, what do you think people don't understand or don't grasp really of people who have been through the justice system, or prisoners, or people who've been involved in this way? What do you have that other people don't have?
I think what we have is the lived experience of the complexity of the reasons why people end up in prison. It's very easy to simplify it down to there are some good people in the world and there's some terrible, awful people in the world, and we don't care what happens to them because they break the law.
It's too black and white, I suppose.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's a very, that's a commonplace understanding, isn't it, of imprisonment. You can say these are just bad people, and they don't warrant our concern. They don't warrant our care. They've offended us as a community. They've done awful stuff. They've hurt us, and now they have to suffer the consequences of that, and we don't care what pain they go through.
Suffer's the word there, I suppose.
They suffer the consequences, but the suffering, what I would say from the understanding that I've gathered through my lived experience, is that the weighting of responsibility on one individual for an action is a very convenient way we disassociate ourselves in community from our responsibility for the conditions that may have driven that person into that act. And if you look at, and that, I don't want people say, oh no, but people have done these things, they've had active choices.
Yeah.
But what I know from the complexity of my life and of the work that I've done subsequently, listening to thousands of prisoners and their stories in my work since 2000, since my release, is that there are things such as adverse childhood experiences that people witness. They grow up around alcoholic parents, they grow up around substance misuse parents, they don't have the equality of opportunity to schooling, they don't enjoy the privilege that some people experience of wealth and well-being and emotional security. And these things create fragilities and vulnerabilities within individuals that mean they're more likely to not be able to read and write properly, suffer mental ill health, suffer physical ill health, feel disassociated from society, and therefore they are lost from and more likely to make poor choices that lead them down the route of offending against the community. And if you look at that, so one of the things I'm really worried about, for instance, is the proportion of young people who are in the care system of the state in the UK who end up in the prison system. You're more likely, if you're in the care system, to go to prison than you are to go to further education. That's the responsibility of the state. That can't be those children's responsibility. They've been taken out of dysfunctional, harmful environments into the care of the state. And we, as the community, as taxpayers, haven't been able to help those children to navigate that trauma. We've actually added to that trauma, and then we add to it more when they fail and are criminalised because of their poor choices into the criminal justice system and destroy those people's lives forever. So that's one thing I'm worried about how we don't recognise. My lived experience has taught me, and I look at my own life, there are so many complexities about why people end up making these poor choices. it's not always a rational decision. It's an irrational decision. I was a drug user. My thoughts were not rational. No. They were irrational. I know that now because I'm free from drugs since 2004. But I didn't know that at the time. When you use cocaine, it permits you to take risks in ways that you wouldn't take risks now. Yeah? It's designed for that.
It's disinhibiting. You're not thinking straight. Yeah.
So understanding that, what were the causes of that? Those questions, why was I using drugs? What were the things that I was encountering? Domestic violence. 9 times police came to my house for domestic violence before I went to prison. Where was that taken into account as mitigation? And in understanding of why I committed the crimes I had. And on release from prison, so the stigmatisation of people who've been to prison, the continued othering of those people, of us, of me, the continuing lack of trust, the lack of welcome back to community, the lack of support from the community to recognise that people have made bad choices, but they've paid the price. They've been in prison.
And it's not
and now we should be prepared to reintegrate them and not hold them to account for the rest of their lives, because you might say, well, you don't get off that easy, but prisoners don't get off that easy. As a mother who've gone to prison myself, it's a life sentence. It's not a 4-year sentence or an 8-year sentence. It's a life sentence. I look at my kids now who were without me for 4 years, and I look how it shaped them, and I feel responsible, and I feel sad, and I feel guilty, and it's a constant reminder of failure. So to have other people deem me a failure as well would probably drive me under.
Yeah.
What keeps me afloat, is my persistence and belief in myself, but it's also the support of great people, good people. I call them the angels in our community, who see beyond offences, who deal with the moral conundrums that are become visible, emerge within us when we talk about prison and we talk about crime. It's, I often say it's not a morally neutral conversation, but the good people are people who've done the internal work about what do I feel about the crime, but what do I know about the evidence of what works to support people to move beyond this? How do I see the broader picture about where our society is responsible and what we're responsible for, and how do we all come to a safe place together? That's where the good people, they've negotiated that internally, and they then are prepared to offer support to people, and definitely have been people in my life, in my journey, who've absolutely, I call, lighthouses of people who've gone, do you know what, Paula, no matter what, you're a person, we want you back, we recognise your strengths, and we want you to flourish, and we're not gonna hold that mistake, however grave that mistake is, against you for the rest of your life. We want you to do well. And we need more of those people in our community to gather round and act in solidarity and act as allies and act as supporters to people who've had tough times, because there isn't really anybody in prison who hasn't had a tough time. And people might go, we've all had tough times, and we can all, I've had tough times too, but I didn't make those choices. Yeah, well, that's you. And
it's luck of the dice sometimes. It's luck of the dice sometimes. I think there could be an argument made that any one of us, everyone makes bad decisions. Yeah. I make bad decisions all the time. Sometimes they can lead you down a path that gets you involved with the justice system, and people should be treated with some empathy there, I think, sometimes.
I think treated with some empathy, and we should also look at the demographics of people who go into the justice system overarchingly, and you should look at about it's generally people from poor communities who end up in the justice system. And you should be looking at that too, what is our responsibility around poverty and lack of opportunity, and not it's easy to focus in on this sort of individual choice aspect, and that's not to move away from everybody has personal responsibility and individual responsibility, but like I said, some people have better chances than others.
And so how did your experience lead you into the Trust then, and what does the Prison Reform Trust aim to do?
The Prison Reform Trust is a sort of advocacy research think tank. It's like much more policy orientated. It's about trying to lobby government in the UK, support operational developments within what they call the HMPPS, what's it stand for? Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service in the UK. So I work very closely with operational leads and ministers and senior civil servants, and that's like highly unusual for a former prisoner to have that access, and that's primarily because of the Prison Reform Trust has that access, and I'm privileged to work at the Prison Reform Trust as a senior manager member, and so can utilise that access as a sort of a platform for change. How did I get there? Wow, that was a long journey. That was not an easy journey either, because, as I've said, it's highly unusual to see a former prisoner in a strategic position. And when I came out of prison in 2008, I don't think any former prisoners worked in the CJS system at all. So I can talk from my lived experience of how difficult it is to come out of prison, even when you really want to do good work. I didn't have a firm idea of how I wanted to contribute to the prison system when I first came out of prison. I just knew that I'd witnessed such a waste of resources, misplaced resources, poor practice, missed opportunities to support people effectively, and a lot of just warehousing people. And I think that's what I've come here in Jersey and Guernsey and noticed, is that the system is very different here, and it's quite, I've just had a visit. I've just come from a visit at the prison in Guernsey and come away going, wow, I wish that we had this in the UK.
Oh, I wanted to come on to that, because obviously you've come over to Jersey and Guernsey. You said you've had a chance to visit both prisons?
No, I haven't been to the one in Jersey, but I've been to the one in Guernsey this morning, yeah.
And what did you make of your experience? Did you speak to prisoners there? What did you do?
I spoke to prisoners, staff, to the governor. Really impressive. Just a real focus in the prison on rehabilitation. And so for me, if a prison sentence has rehabilitation at its core, then it has purpose, and it has to be, meaningful. But sadly, in the UK, the prison system is overwhelmed through lack of resourcing, overcrowding, difficulty to recruit prison officers to the job, and it just means that prisoners end up lying on their beds in their cells, and that's not really a rehabilitative function. It's not delivering rehabilitation to the public. That's just warehousing people. And I always talk about, if you think about prisoners as a car, and your car breaks down, and you take it to the garage, and you expect the mechanic to put it on the machine, do an analysis of why it's broken down, don't you, and find out what part's missing, and buy the part, fix the part, tell you to come back in X amount of weeks, and pay the money. You'd think, okay, that's right. But if the mechanic said to you, do you know what? Don't know really what's wrong with it. Can't be bothered to find out. Stick it in the yard for 4 years. Come back. I think it might have fixed itself.
I've never heard that analogy before. That's great. Yeah.
But you would think, what am I? But still give you a bill.
Yeah.
Because remember, taxpayers pay to keep people in prison. The purpose is, yes, to acknowledge harm, to make recompense to victims, and I understand how important that is. That we acknowledge the harm that's been done, and that victims feel validated and feel healed and restored by virtue of the action of separating a person who's caused harm from the community and demonstrating the displeasure around that crime. I 100% get that. But what we also want to do is make sure people come out and don't do it again.
Yeah. Because
it's the failure of the intervention if people keep going on a revolving door of crime, isn't it? That means the interventions and the service has failed. And that's the point where my work comes in, actually, which is about, I lead on sort of prisoner involvement, which is prisoner feedback. Essentially, any business, any customer here on the podcast, if your listeners say, do you know what, they don't tune in, you'd have to analyse, maybe the content isn't what they want to listen to. Maybe we're not doing it right. You don't blame the listeners to say, why won't they tune in? You go, you take responsibility for responding to the user need. Yeah. And you listen to your feedback and take it seriously. A lot of businesses listen to their customer feedback. How many times have you been asked to leave, like, TripAdvisor, and, leave reviews of the hotel so that people, A, feel reassured about the quality of the service, but also learn from the feedback. See, in prisons in the UK, people don't ever ask prisoners, are we doing this right?
Yeah. I suppose there's a historic assumption that why would you ask?
Yeah. But it's not pragmatic, is it?
No.
It's morally loaded. It's what I talk about. It's not a morally neutral space. It's morally loaded not to ask a customer of a service user of a service. You're actually saying we don't care about your view, your experience of our service, even. Your experience. We don't even want to check if we're doing this right because we don't believe your view counts. So it's morally loaded, and that's why I think like more sophisticated discussions about criminal justice, people need to address the moral issues that and they need to be clear about the pragmatism of asking, the pragmatism of why we're doing, the intention of the work, and so it's morally loaded not to ask them. It's inherently effective to ask them.
Yeah.
Because when we get the feedback from prisoners about what will work, what would work, what are the interventions that work. When I was in prison, nobody asked me. They sent me on pointless courses when I needed counselling or I needed therapy or I needed, detox from drugs or I needed like visions of hope for the future and access to careers counselling and different skills development. These are the things that help us to come out and not to return back. But if you don't ask me and you only ever operate from your own expert view, which does not integrate the insight of the people who've used the service, then you'll only ever replicate the same knowledge over and over again. Development of knowledge comes from the integration of diverse perspectives, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like the integration of diverse perspectives allows us to move forward towards innovation and new ideas. It takes a team, and the prisoner voice, the prisoner insight, the end user insight is an important component of that wisdom that we need to solve these problems. Solve it.
So what did you see in Guernsey that you liked then? Because you mentioned that
I liked the emphasis on rehabilitative within the prison. I really liked the emphasis and the dedication of the governor and his team to rehabilitating prisoners. They showed great sensitivity around understanding the complexity of the task that's hand, the complexity of issues with which people present in the criminal justice system, and they were really prepared to work in a very humane way, delivering the sentence of the court. So delivering the punitive element of the sentence, but also recognising that their job was to prepare, train, equip prisoners in the prison to come out and be contributing citizens, and that required, they've got a psychologist in the prison, they've got sort of couples therapy, family therapy, all manner of interventions around employability skills. I saw a workshop for woodworking. I saw greenhouses.
Fantastic garden there.
Greenhouses.
I've seen it before, it's amazing.
Commercial growing, at scale. Like amazing, like sort of waste recycling, building. What were they? Saw logs. People were building skills from which they can exit the prison and return to island life. And I think that the prison's doing an amazing job. If I can be really brutally honest, I think the part that is lacking is that I see still a lot of negative and suspicious attitudes, antiquated attitudes towards naming and shaming of people in the island who've offended. And I think that's, as a person who's, from my lived experience, who's been named in the paper in my sentence. So I was named in the Sun. You don't get the Sun here, but it's
we've read this. I try not to read the Sun.
Yeah, well, me too. Me too. I genuinely try not to read it after this experience, let alone what happened in Liverpool. But I was working on release on temporary licence, and I heard today that you also have that here in Guernsey, where some people towards the end of their sentence who are risk assessed as being safe to return are allowed to come out to work on the island. And that's great. That's great preparation for release and prevents the difficulties around transitioning from an institution back to family life. And I was one of those people who was able to work on release on temporary licence. And somebody sold a story about me to the newspaper.
So beyond the story of what originally happened.
So the story in the newspaper, they followed me for the day. Without my knowledge, the journalists published my photograph and published a story saying, drug lag let out to work in drugs rife Handsworth. I'll never forget it. With my photograph, most awful photograph of me that you've ever seen. I'm much better looking than the photograph they printed. I think it was the worst photograph anybody could have ever taken of me at the worst angle. And
while you're out and about? While
I was out and about. And published it in the Sun, national newspaper, readership of millions. And the very next day, on the day of the publication, I was going to work as normal from the prison, being released, going on the train, walking to the bus stop, catching the bus, catching the train, catching the bus to my job. I felt really proud of myself that I had this volunteer opportunity, that I was trusted by the prison. I saw this as a signal of hope for the future. I saw this as the potential to redefine my life and be proud of myself and to make my children proud of me. And then I was outed very publicly in this paper, and I was sitting on the train watching people read the Sun, looking over their paper at me.
Kind of dragged you back, maybe.
Dragged me back, maybe frightened, because I felt very vulnerable. I know that people don't like people who've been to prison. Yeah. And I felt, what if I'm attacked? What if somebody speaks to me? What if somebody wants to challenge me? What can I say? What can I do? And so there was that actual physical fear that somebody would be rude to me and that I wouldn't know how to react, and I can't react either.
No.
So that's a very unpleasant feeling. It's like being bullied at school and being frightened of the school bullies going to pick on you. So that was that wider piece. But then the other piece was like the embarrassment of it all, because I'm here trying to lead a different life and, being shamed in that way.
Being reminded.
It was so hurtful. And then the consequence of that, so talking back to what I see here, is the consequence of that is that when I did come out of prison and I got a job, so I was working on release on temporary licence, very fortunate to get a job with the same organisation that took me on as a prisoner. And I became the regional manager there. And it was very easy for people to Google me and to find out about my past. And I couldn't ever move away from it because my picture was there, clear. You can still Google me to this day. I naively at that time thought that people wouldn't do that at work. And I was the regional manager, and I was at work one day, and one of my team came to me and said, "Paula, have you been in prison?" And thank God I did not lie. And I went, "Yeah, I have." And he said, "I knew that because I Googled you, Paula." And I went,
It's a different world now, isn't it?
But it's like at that precise moment, I can tell you what happened to me is that the very fragile identity that I had of a newly returned prisoner collapsed. And I felt, I can only equate it, if you're struggling with, your sexuality, and then you haven't even told your mum and dad that you're struggling with your sexuality, and then somebody announces you as gay in the newspaper. That's how it felt, like being publicly outed. That's how I felt when he brought that to my attention, because they could access it on the paper. I could never deny it. I could never move on beyond it. And so I talk about the next stage of that story is that why allies, why people who support you and have got your back in those moments is so important. Because at that moment when he said that to me, I was so frightened that everybody was gossiping about me.
Was he supportive, or was he?
You know, he was supportive. He was trying to say, you need to get a handle on this, Paula. People are gossiping about you. There's a team of 16. You're the regional manager. I felt like my professional identity, credibility was smashed to smithereens. And I rang my boss and I said, Adam, what do I do? And he said, Paula, open the laptop. Send a global email to everybody. I've got you on this. Yeah, he said, send a global email. Say, I understand that there's gossip in the teams about my conviction, my criminal conviction. Adam, the chief executive, has all of the relevant details.
Yeah.
If you'd like to, if you're concerned and you'd like to discuss this with him, here's his mobile number.
But nobody called him, did they?
Nobody called him. And I said, what would happen, Adam, if people call you? He said, listen, Paula, I believe in you. I believe in that I'm doing the right thing by supporting you. If other people don't want to understand that, then they're probably not welcome in my organisation. And that was such a strong message about get ahead of the information flow, be strong, find allies, and you know, it's a call out to the community to do that as well. And I know it's difficult because sometimes people have done really abhorrent stuff and it's frightening. And I work in prisons with people convicted of sexual offences, for instance, now. And sometimes I'm horrified. I'm a mum with kids and I think, oh my God, you know, but I have to contend with, I would rather do something that the evidence, the research evidence says is helpful to supporting a person to stop doing that act, to think differently, to give them better options, better cognitive skills, to recognise, you know, their thinking patterns. I would rather they have exposure to all of those opportunities so that they come out and they're safe.
Yeah.
Because people don't stay in prison forever. They come out, they're our neighbours, they sit on the bus, they sit in podcasts.
They come and chat to me.
They sit in podcasts. You know, we come out, and wouldn't we all rather that we work together on solving the problems that brought us into that awful situation in the first place, so that we can live together as contributing citizens? I think that's, like, for me, why I do this work and why it's so important to have discussions about criminal justice that are more sophisticated than just we're good,
you're bad,
and they're bad.
Yeah. Are you so you spoke to prisoners in both Guernsey and Jersey. And obviously the islands are very tight. They're small communities. Mm-hmm. I mean, were these concerns that you raised about naming and shaming, did they speak about this to you?
Yeah, people have spoken to me about that.
What did they?
It's hard, isn't it? It's hard to, I mean, how I've coped with, because, you know, in the UK we have it as well, so it's not just about Guernsey, and Jersey. But so forgive me if that came across like, you know, we don't do it. Yeah.
No, not at all.
We
not
do it
all.
too. Like we do. I could look at the story I just told you about, you know, and I had hate mail, anonymous hate mail, and I have trolls on Twitter constantly. But sorry, the point.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of talking about prisoners in Guernsey and Jersey, and if they brought the same thing, because it's something I contend with as a journalist.
Yeah.
Because I believe that justice should be transparent, and that we go to court cases all the time. And I think it's correct that we report what happens in courts in Guernsey so people see what happens in courts. A hidden court system, I think, is a bad thing. I don't think reporting on things after the fact, such as your experience, is appropriate or helpful at all. But
the internet has changed things, hasn't it? So the footprint. So if you, in the time when that was like naming and I understand about transparency, right? And I do get that point, but you have to weigh up the merits of transparency against harm, don't you?
Yeah.
And is transparency just voyeurism?
Sometimes.
Do you
It's
know what I
hard
mean?
to
And
tread
so
that line.
one of my big things is that, voyeurism isn't helpful in this debate either, right? And actually that's quite shameful. Do we get some perverse joy out of reading about the most awful things that human beings do to one another? And it doesn't necessarily protect victims either.
No.
Because it's traumatizing for victims to see that so explored. There are some things that are, you have to get the balance right about when it's appropriate. And I do think that in the times of newspaper print, when that would have been archived and somebody would have had to look for that in the libraries, is different from the internet footprint that follows people throughout their journey back to community.
And you can stick a name in Google.
I can, why I suppose I've coped with that, because my case, I was in the Sun. You can Google me. And I had that experience of being outed publicly. And my response to that was, I'm never going to let anybody do that to me ever again. So I'm going to get it in first. I'm going to take control of it. I'm going to announce myself as a former prisoner. And then you can't harm me, because the harm that creates is so deeply disorientating when you're trying to, navigate two identities, that of a MM4865 Harriott, sentenced for 8 years, to regional manager, change makers, senior management team member at the Prison Reform Trust, as I am now. You've somehow got to integrate all of those identities to merge, and pretending it hasn't happened leaves you quite vulnerable to being exposed. So for me, as a coping strategy, I have used it as a tool for liberation from all of that.
Yeah.
I recognise it's not so easy for other people, because some people have more, drugs is a crime that sometimes is more politically acceptable, more, to the public test, do you know what I mean, than
opinions
people
of
convicted of
drugs.
sexual offences.
Yeah.
People convicted of fraud have a lot of difficulty because it's about dishonesty.
Especially finding new jobs or moving on with careers or
So
reintegration.
I wouldn't say that that's the way forward for everybody, but it's worked for me.
Were there any? So you've done, when you've come over here, you've given I think, how many seminars have you given? Is it just
two?
Is it two?
For Lloyds Bank Foundation. So thank you very much for Lloyds Bank Foundation for bringing me over. I've had a fabulous time meeting some really sensitive and sophisticated practitioners, leaders in the sector here, who've spoken really deeply and with expertise around the complexities of the issues that this subject brings up, criminal justice. So, some great practice here.
Were you queried on any island-specific challenges? Or asked any questions that...
I don't know. In many ways, yes, there might be some specific island challenges, right? The sort of inability to become invisible here post-conviction, for instance, is a massive challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
It's much easier to disappear in London. If you don't have an internet footprint, potential to reconfigure your life, go to another town. You can't. It's a small community. These are small communities where we're very interconnected. So that has some challenges, but it also has some benefits. So I learned at the prison today about the interconnectedness of families can also mean that prison officers have better relationships with people in prison because they know their families. And practitioners I've met say, I can't walk down the street without seeing 5-6 people who've been in prison in the past. So there's a sort of those closer relationships can also be used in a positive way to knit together support.
We interviewed an ex-prisoner who said exactly the same thing. He said that Guernsey has, the very fact that we have a small knit community means that when he left the prison system, he had family and friends and everybody just so close. He wasn't divorced from everybody else. He was here, and he said that really helped him. Yeah,
I think that is one of the benefits. Do you know what I mean? But what we need to do is make sure that everybody's on the right page. So employers are on the right page. The legislators, the political leaders in this and the islands are also on the same page. And I know that people go, oh, it's competing priorities, I'd rather build a school than invest in a prison. But when you're invested in the criminal justice system, you're investing in the safety of our communities and the peace of our communities, and also to get upstream of some of these problems, like prevention, better than cure, like dealing with things early, and looking to our responsibility about poverty, about lack of support for people with mental ill health or substance misuse, and looking at the drivers of crime. These are also aspects that we need to pay some attention to, as well as listening to Prisoner Insight.
I just wanted to return back to we spoke before about parents of children, parents who go into the system. We know in Guernsey that children of incarcerated parents are more likely to reoffend in the future themselves, and this is a cycle in itself. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How is that a cycle that can be broken?
Wow, I would say, if at all possible, as a mother, don't send mothers to prison.
Yeah, I mean
that would be the first thing. Divert women who are mothers mothers in particular, out of the criminal justice system if at all possible. There's in the UK, I don't know the facts and figures here, but in the UK, the majority of women go to prison for non-violent crime and for very short sentences. But those short sentences have the ability to really disrupt children's education, children's development, their emotional stability, and these are the drivers of intergenerational crime. So there's big push in the UK on diverting women out of custody if at all possible, and sending them to bespoke women's centres, gender specific, support that's about counselling, therapy, addressing domestic violence, addressing the causes of those crimes. So that would be my first thing, if we could at all possible. Then if we are sending both dads and mums to prison, to recognise the importance of family and recognise the rights of the child in the debate, because children are immensely damaged by parental imprisonment. Children of imprisoned parents have higher rates of mental ill health, more likely to be excluded from school. It's an adverse childhood experience that can lead to substance misuse, alcohol use in the future, and definitely is linked to intergenerational crime. So I think both the court system ought to look at the rights of the child in the sentencing length, for instance, and try to minimise the disruption if at all possible. I think that the prison then, and I've seen great work at Guernsey Prison today around family therapy, inviting families into sentencing, keeping families abreast of the progress of that person in prison so that families feel part of the conversation. I'd also say that it's trying in our community to support the imprisoned families as a whole, because the families of prisoners feel tainted by the sentence themselves. So we heard today of some great training at the prison around hidden sentence, the hidden sentence that the families serve alongside their loved one in prison, and the shame of that. At one of my seminars, I noticed a woman was very tearful, and I spoke to her afterwards, and she let me know that she was distressed because her husband had been in prison and she had never been able to speak about it. Yeah.
Did she feel like it wasn't her thing to speak about, or was it?
Potentially, or just the sort of like shame, embarrassment, how other people might perceive that. Or she said, people who knew didn't know what to say or what support to offer. So it became, I suppose, like it's sometimes when one of your family members dies, people are not quite sure how to address that in work, are they? Or
no.
We have a sort of peculiar way of going, it's a bit awkward to talk about, so I'd rather not say anything. But actually that silence can be interpreted as emotional neglect, lack of care, when it might not be that. Do you know what I mean? It might just, we don't have the words to express, or we don't know what to say or do. And I think that may well be the case around families.
Even harder with prison sentences, surely. If
Yeah.
you know somebody at work or a friend and a partner or a family member has gone to prison, I wouldn't even know what to begin to say compared to if somebody had passed away in that family.
Well, I say takes a village to raise a child, doesn't it? And that's we should be, all of us, you know, if it comes across our path as a challenge, then maybe it's our duty as citizens to respond to that challenge, because it's your challenge if it's come to your attention, and that would be my I suppose parting shot there, really, to say sometimes we're always waiting for somebody else to solve the problem, and actually agency, citizenship is about recognising sometimes it's our duty to solve the problem. That's not to devolve it to our legislators or devolve it to our policy people or devolve it to another service. It's about to speak up about it in our personal life, to recognise our need to respond to that, to join forces with other people that are responding to that. You know, you don't have to do it all on your own. There are agencies. Go and volunteer. Go and contribute some money. Do something. Because it's in all of our interest to do something rather than to be passive bystanders around pain and distress and disorder.
Absolutely. One last question, if you allow me to have this one.
On.
And it's because that was a brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
No, I hope you've enjoyed yourself.
Oh my God! Can we please talk about my podcast?
Of course we can. We can finish off on talking about it. If you let me ask just
you can indeed.
One more question, which is less fun, and then we can talk about your podcast. Because investment and money is a big talking point in both islands. We're folding into the new year about how we fund everything.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is reform of prisons possible without investment, or is money involved in these discussions about how we change what happens in a prison?
Resources are always involved, resources are always involved. But resources are not just money, are they? Their commitment, their commitment, their intention, their activity, their kindness. You know, like human kindness doesn't have a cost attached to it, does it? Compassion doesn't have a cost attached to it. Yes, we do need to drive resources. We need to have a look at structural issues, systemic issues, mapping the system, who's doing what, combining collectively. Obviously, all of that is important work to be done, but it's going to be driven by change makers who are compelled to do that because they're moved at a moral level and with a political lens and a vision for change, that they know it's the right thing to do.
Okay. That's a good answer.
Okay.
Well, you can tell me about your podcast now. Because I'm told that you have a podcast that we listen to.
I do have a podcast, and I'll thank you so much for letting me come on today.
Oh, no, I've really enjoyed it.
I have a podcast myself in the UK called The Secret Life of Prisons.
And it's done quite well, apparently.
It has done quite well. I'm really proud to announce today we've been nominated in the top 5 independent podcasts for what's called the ARIAs, which I don't know what that stands for, but I do know it's the Radio Academy Awards, and they're like the BAFTAs. So now that we're nominated, I can buy a really nice ball gown, get my hair done, get my nails done, and actually pose with the people from BBC One shows and BBC One
That's
Extra.
amazing.
You know, it's like all the top people from radio, they go to these awards.
When is this?
It's in May. We'll hear if we, on the awards ceremony. So it's
That's
proper.
super
You go to
exciting.
the awards ceremony. They have presenters. They read out who, and then the camera goes to you. We've got a 1 in 5 chance.
I reckon you've got a very good chance. So your podcast is, what's it about?
The Secret Life of Prisons. It's an attempt to bring the very secret world of prisons. Like what happens in a prison?
Yeah.
What are prisoners like? What's a cell like? What is it like to live in a cell? What's it like to have a visit? Those are the things that we're just trying to create a window into the secret life of prisons. And it's my co-host is Phil Maguire, who's the chief executive of the National Prison Radio. So in the UK, we have a national prison radio station that broadcasts to all prisons in the UK. So it's 120 prisons. So our podcast is available on Spotify and all other platforms for external listeners, but prisoners also listen to it.
That's great.
And so it's it's a radio show on National Prison Radio. So we have former prisoners come in to talk to us. We have guests. We have researchers come in to talk to us. We did 2 episodes quite recently on the secret life of serving a life sentence.
That would be fascinating.
What is it like to actually serve a sentence of 14, 15, 20 years? And we had 2 released people who'd committed very serious crime to come on and talk to us, along with Professor Ben Crew of Cambridge University, who just published a new research paper on the impact of long sentences on individuals. So, we try to tackle some difficult subjects, but it has some light-hearted moments where we crack jokes. And I hope through listening to it, people get to just have a broader understanding of what's happening within prisons, and think about the purpose of imprisonment and what we as a society want from it. How do we balance the needs of retribution with rehabilitation? Do we get that balance right? And just come away going, well, I know a lot more.
Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for having me. And thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Bailiwick Express podcast. The title track was Shift My Weight by Luno. If you enjoyed it, I know it's a pain, but please like and share. It all helps, and remember, you can hit bailiwickexpress.com to stay right up to date with whatever is happening in the Bailiwick. You can find us online, on social, on email, and on internet radio. There'll be more from me, Matthew Leach, and all the Bailiwick Express team next Friday.